taking the time to come and listen to this session. So I'll be presenting on some work that we've done, and the title is Using a Program-Based Approach to Understand the University Experience of Black Students, a Case for Decolonizing. So this is based on some work that we did with our undergraduate students on our psychology programs. In terms of the outline of my presentation, I'm going to start off by giving you a brief background information, looking at the literature that has informed our work, and then presenting what the aims were when we undertook this study, what our research questions were. I'll also talk about the methodology that we've used, the results, conclusion and recommendations, and end by reflecting on my role as a researcher in this process. Okay, so to begin us, to start us off, we'll talk about a few bits of background information, as I've said. So I suppose the whole reason for this session and the rest of the week and the decolonization project as a whole is based on what's been identified across higher education in general. So we know that there's what's been called an awarding gap that's been identified. And what this means is when you compare the degree outcomes for students, you find that there's a 13% gap between white students and Black and ethnic minority students in the final degree that they're awarded. So the awarding gap is concerned with students achieving what's called a good honors degree. So you're looking at the proportions of students achieving at least an upper second class degree or a first class degree. So the proportions are lower across higher education for Black and ethnic minority students as compared to white students. And then when you break the BAME student grouping further, looking at it at a more granular level, so the awarding gap is even larger between white and Black students, identified at 23% by advanced HE. So there is cause for concern there in terms of what's going on and why that gap has persisted for such a long time. And when you look at also at the extent of disparities between white students and Black and ethnic minority students, it goes beyond the final degree that they are awarded at the end of their studies. So we know that Black and ethnic minority students are less likely to finish their studies. Dropout rates are much higher than their white counterparts. Effects also go beyond the awarding gap, but also the employment prospects when they finish their degrees. So when you look at numbers of statistics around graduate employment, 15 months after graduation, again, employment rates are much lower for Black and ethnic minority students than for white students. So because this gap has persisted across higher education for such a long time, there's been research efforts to try to understand what could be happening in regards to what could be causing the gap. So the early efforts to look at this in detail identified factors that Black and ethnic minority students had that meant that they were not able to achieve the same outcomes as their white counterparts. So these kinds of studies tended to identify factors such as coming from a disadvantaged educational background, having a poor knowledge of the admissions process, being a first in family to attend higher education, having caring responsibilities, and so forth. So these are some of the factors that tended to be identified at the time. But the issue with such an approach, as you can see, is it's solely focusing on factors related to the student themselves. So it's placing blame on students for not being able to achieve as well as their white counterparts. And more importantly, this kind of approach doesn't account for the fact that when some of these factors have been controlled for, that awarding gap still persists So clearly there's something going on beyond the kind of educational or level of educational experience and achievement that students come to university with. Another issue as well is that it doesn't account for subject-specific variations in the gap. So when you break down that data across HE, you find that generally there's differences across a range of subjects. There are some subjects with much higher gaps, some with much lower gaps. So there's clearly something going on there at the subject level as well. And more importantly, this kind of approach minimizes and obscures the role of structural inequalities and racism. So if we're to meaningfully redress these issues and close the awarding gap, we really need to acknowledge the role that structural inequalities and racism have to play in that awarding gap. So this approach of identifying blame within the student themselves is part of what's known as the deficit model, because it's identifying those deficits within Black and ethnic minority students. And also, when you look at it from that perspective, the responsibility then for addressing the gap lies with the student, whereas we know that there are factors that occur at the institutional level that we can address and change, and that changes outcomes for students. So following on from this early work, and after it was recognized that there must be something more happening at university, there was an approach that was taken to kind of try to understand the kind of experiences that our Black and ethnic minority students have during their time at university. So there's been quite a lot of research that's looked at their experience at university, trying to understand what's going on. And these kinds of studies have identified a range of factors that seem to be that seems to be part and parcel of the experience of our Black and ethnic minority students while they're at university. So one of the most commonly identified factors is this sense of unbelonging. So Black and ethnic minority students don't feel like they belong at university. And they often talk about it quite a lot in these studies that explore their experiences. And when you look at this lack of belonging or unbelonging at university, it tends to be underscored by a lack of adequate representation of BAME individuals. So this is representation both across the student body and representation within the staff that they exposed to at university as well. So when you look at some recent figures in terms of the staff at UK universities, particularly those in more senior levels, in more senior levels, there is much lower levels of representation of BAME individuals. So, for example, it's been found that approximately just 1% of UK academics in the at professor level identify as Black, and that's inspired a range of student movements such as Why Isn't My Professor Black, which started at UCL in 2014, and Why Is My Professor Still Not Black in 2016. So there's clearly issues there in terms of the lack of visible role models, particularly at those higher levels. So this not having role models that look like them has a negative impact on their sense of aspiration. So they don't feel like academia is something for them because there isn't enough people around that look like them. So it negatively impacts on their sense of aspiration. Low levels of representation also impact on sense of community. So they don't feel like they belong, they feel out of place when they're in university environments. And this is something that's highlighted in a paper by Osborne et al., where she was looking at Black students in particular, and this kind of sense of unbelonging was linked to this idea of Black bodies being out of place in higher education. They didn't feel that because of the lack of representation, that they belonged in that setting. Another factor that comes up when Black students or Black and ethnic minority students talk about their experiences at university is that of racial microaggressions. So they experience what are termed racial microaggressions, and these have been defined as everyday racial slights and degradations that racially minoritized people experience. So this was a definition provided by Joseph Salisbury in 2019. So students talk a lot about these racial microaggressions and how they form part and parcel of their university experience. There's all sorts of specific examples that they give. So, for example, unsolicited touching of their hair, people being overly interested in their hair being strange, for example. So it makes them feel like they're other. They're not part and parcel of the norm. Black and ethnic minority students also talk about being exposed to negative racial stereotypes. So there's quite a lot of different negative racial stereotypes that they report experiencing. So, for example, stereotypes related to criminality. In one of the papers, they looked at how Black male students, for example, were approached by people trying to buy drugs off them, even though they were not drug dealing themselves. So because of that stereotype, that negative racial stereotype associated with their ethnicity, they're exposed to this kind of behavior. Being perceived as being of low intellectual capability as opposed to their white peers, or being generally perceived as bad. There's a recent report that's come out from Unite about living while Black at university that explores these issues within student accommodation. So they are quite prevalent. So we can see from this literature that there's specific experiences that Black and ethnic minority students tend to have that negatively impact on their time at university. And it's quite important to understand what the experience of students is in order for us to understand what the roles of racism and other structural inequalities might be as part of trying to understand that awarding gap. But it's also important to try to understand what Black and ethnic minority students themselves perceive as reasons for the gap. So what's tended to happen in the literature in the past was, there was a move to try to get just to generally understand what the experience at university is. But some recommendations that were made by the NUS and UUK in a report they produced in 2019, they were talking about how, as part of their actions for addressing the awarding gap, institutions need to actively engage their students in trying to speak to them about the awarding gap, understanding what they perceive themselves to be reasons for the awarding gap, to try to get a more holistic understanding. Another issue with the current research that we have is quite a lot of research has predominantly treated the BAME group as homogeneous. So BAME stands for Black and Ethnic Minority, students. So it encompasses a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different backgrounds. Ultimately, people have different experiences. They're not a homogeneous group. So in treating the group as homogeneous, it overshadows, it hides the specific experiences that specific groups might have. So we need a more granular approach, a more nuanced approach that tries to understand how specific groups are impacted, what their experience is, what they themselves believe to be reasons for the awarding gap. Also, it's also important to look at this in terms of what's happening at program level. So hence we've titled this this talk a program-based approach, because when you look at the data on the awarding gap, it varies according to different subject areas. So it's also important to have that more granular understanding of what's happening specifically on different programs, because there are these variations according to subject level that are present. So as a result of the gaps that we identified in the literature, the aim of our study was to qualitatively explore reasons for the awarding gap from the perspective of Black psychology undergraduate students. So we specifically identified Black students because when you look at those numbers in terms of the awarding gap, they tend to disproportionately affect Black students more than any of the other minority ethnic groups. So we thought that would be a good starting point. Also looking at psychology undergraduate students for that more granular approach that looks at what's happening at the program level, but also thinking about psychology as a discipline as well. It's a discipline that's invested in the study of human behavior, and it seeks to make generalizations about human behavior. So it takes a nomothetic approach to studying behavior, and this is quite problematic if you think about the fact that there are those differences between people. So the research questions that we had was, first of all, as other studies have done, looking at what the experience of Black undergraduate psychology students is while they're at university, but also more importantly, trying to understand their own perceptions of what the reasons for the BAME awarding gap might be. So in order to help us meet those aims, we conducted some focus group with our undergraduate psychology students. So these were students that were on the various undergraduate psychology programs. We had a total of 2 focus groups with 16 students. So there were 8 students in each focus group, and they ranged in age between 18 to 20 years. 11 of the students identified as Black African, 5 identified as Black Caribbean, and all of them were female. And that's really because of the nature of the psychology programs being predominantly female. We utilized a purposive sampling approach. So when we're advertising the study, we're explicitly looking for undergraduate students who identified as Black. And in terms of recruiting our participants, we got them through the psychology research participation scheme. So all undergraduate psychology students in their first and second year of study take part in a range of psychology-based research studies as part of their research methods training, and they're awarded course credit for participation in these studies. We received ethical approval for the study from the Faculty Research Ethics Committee. So we conducted the study according to ethics guidelines. So, for example, we talked about confidentiality at the beginning of each focus group, reminding participants about not sharing information that was shared by other participants as well, and so forth. And they signed informed consent as well prior to taking part in the study. All of the focus group were facilitated by myself, and that was a deliberate attempt to have someone there that could identify with the participants to allow them to freely discuss their experiences. At the beginning of each focus group, I started by presenting the awarding gap, making them aware of this awarding gap and asking them what their thoughts were and what they thought were reasons for the awarding gap. So a sample question that we developed for the focus group was, what do you think could be the reasons why Black students are not performing as well as their white counterparts? So the questions were quite open, and they're also developed based on the discussions that were occurring in the focus group. All focus groups lasted approximately an hour, and we transcribed the focus groups after, we analyzed this data using an inductive thematic analysis approach. So it was very much driven by the data, the codes that were identified from the transcripts. So all three investigators were involved in the analysis. So we very much wanted to make use of researcher triangulation to ensure that there's quality control embedded within the study. So I did the initial derivation of the codes, and they were revised and refined by my two co-investigators. We developed the themes. Initially, it was me and Saima who developed the themes, and then Jess checked whether they were a good fit to the data. So as you can see, there were quality control processes in place. So in terms of what we found then, this is the thematic map representing the themes that came out of the study. So the broad theme was navigating a non-Black environment. So you could see from the extracts from what the participants were saying within the focus groups that they really did not feel like university was a Black environment. So that's why that theme was labeled that. And when you broke it down, the sub-themes related to this were the signs or signals of unbelonging, and the responses they then took to those signals of unbelonging. So in terms of the signals of unbelonging themselves, participants talked about being exposed to negative racial stereotypes and microaggressions, having tutors that were unrelatable. I use the term tutors here to broadly encompass academic staff, so lecturers, personal tutors, any other tutors that students engage with. They also talked about how they found extracurricular activities as unrelatable, and they also communicated that they had frustrations around Black History Month. Responses to these signals of unbelonging, they talked about how they conformed to perceived white norms. They talked about the mindsets that they had, which could either be a source of resilience for them or a barrier to them engaging in their studies. They also talked about experiencing a pressure to overcome these racial barriers. So I'm going to use some of the participants' extracts to exemplify the kinds of information that came out from the focus group. So starting with signals of unbelonging then. So when we talked about, when the participants talked about the negative racial stereotypes that they were exposed to, they talked about how they felt that they were looked down upon. So they were they felt that their lecturers and their peers on the programs as well had much lower expectations of their academic ability, and sometimes these came out in seemingly innocuous interactions that you wouldn't necessarily identify as racist, but it shows how racism can operate in modern day society. So, for example, this participant is talking about an experience they had during a workshop, and they're talking about interactions with their peers. So the participant says, because they're talking to you as if they're kind of dumbing it down, simplifying. For example, when I was working in a group, she said, "Oh, exaggerated slurring of speech. Do you have anything to add too? Or do you have any questions?" And the group laughs. I think we're all part of the group. Like, they make extra effort. Because they're making extra effort, it makes you feel like you're stupid or dumb, like you're a little child, kind of. So this participant is clearly talking about how a peer decided to, by slowing down their speech, the peer had clearly made some sort of assumptions about whether the participant understood what was going on in the group. It could have been assumptions made about their ability to understand the language, or it could have been assumptions made about their just generally their ability to understand. So this kind of thing is seemingly innocuous and seemingly well-intentioned, but actually when you take a step back at why the peer made all these assumptions and approached the student as if they didn't understand what they were going on, then you begin to understand how racism could operate in modern day society. And also when the student talks, says, I think we're all part of the group, they're asserting themselves that actually I am one of you, I am part of the group. Are we not all on the same level? So they were taken aback by why they were treated as if they needed this extra attention from one of their peers. So this really illustrates how racism can operate in an invisibilized manner in society, as opposed to those overt and covert expressions of hate that are commonly associated with racism. Other negative racial stereotypes were more sinister in form that participants were exposed to. So they talked about how they were stereotyped as being angry, being full of attitude, ghetto, being unrefined, being scary and rude. So, for example, this participant says, and I feel like the other dark side of it, they might feel like you're already assuming that I'm going to be scary and rude. I'd like to be scary and rude. I've got that put in my head that she'll probably, even in the elevators, they move. Group members in agreement. I think it's like they think I'll steal something. Like, so it's kind of like, because they're already, like, assume I'm going to be hostile, it just increases the chances of me being hostile. Other participant says, you get your back up, and the participant says, yeah, and the group members in agreement. So here you can see how if our students are being approached with these negative racial stereotypes, they're expected to behave in certain unsavory ways, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as almost a defense mechanism against these negative assumptions that are made against them. So in this particular case, if people are moving away in the elevators and there's assumptions made about criminality there, and she's likely to respond to that in a hostile manner, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you can see why some of these stereotypes then are maintained. This is very similar to what's been identified in other studies. So, for example, the Unite report, Bunce et al., their participants talked about such similar stereotypes. Participants also talked about experiencing racial microaggressions. So I feel like the only thing that puts me off is when white people overdo it sometimes. Like, girl, it makes me uncomfortable and I don't know what to do. You're like forcing your blackness and it makes me feel like, ugh. Another participant says, I feel like I've experienced it once or twice. Stuff like touching my hair or like just weird. To us, it's weird because we don't do it to each other. Like, why are you doing, like, you're overdoing it. Like, just be yourself, because I have a, you have a, sometimes even as much as people weren't saying it, some people are surprised that a Black person couldn't open their mouth, actually have an English accent. It's stuff like that. So these kinds of racial microaggressions that participants experience, it contributes to the othering. So if you think about othering, it's about how white is standard and everyone else is other. And racial microaggressions very much serve the role to remind participants of how they are viewed as other. Participants also talked about how they found tutors, lecturers unrelatable, and they spoke quite a lot about how there weren't many Black lecturers around them. So when you look at kind of these tutors being unrelatable, they also spoke about how it impacted on their help-seeking behavior. So this participant says, I don't know, maybe because lecturers and the teachers at university that are in university, we can't really relate to them because there are not a lot of Black lecturers. So we don't feel like we have someone that we can talk to that might understand us. So we just stick to ourselves and struggle by ourselves, but we don't ask for help as much as we should. So this is quite similar to what's been found in other studies. Stewart et al. Talked about how participants ended up having these coping alone strategies because they didn't feel like they had someone relatable that they could approach for help. And I think this is quite an important one because we often think about diversity in a different sense of you look at kind of having you could think about it as having representation from people from different countries in a department. But when you kind of step into the shoes of specific students, so in this case, if you step into the shoes of a Black student and thinking about how many Black lecturers are in the department, you can clearly see how that perception of diversity begins to fall apart because they might not have anyone around them or one or two people who actually looks like them. Another issue with having unrelatable tutors was this impact on a sense of aspiration. So this participant is talking about our induction week. So what we have during induction week is we have a meet the lecturers session where all the lecturers in the department line up, and this is what this participant is referring to. Do you know that thing they had entered the lecturers lineup? When I saw you, I was like, yes, all became elated in agreement and laugh. It's just to have someone there that kind of like is like you. And I think because you're a woman as well, it helps to like where you're going as well. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, I can do it as well. It's just relatability, and if you can build a relationship with that person. So clearly having these visible role models is important. In this case, the participants were referring to me. They'd seen me as part of that induction event, and that was quite important. I mean, I've never looked at it in that way until I did this study. It was something that I took part in because I had to, or part of kind of developing the psychology community with our students, but I never really thought about it in the sense of my presence could actually be inspiring another Black student. They also talked about unrelatable extracurriculars. It's like going back to what she said before. When you look at things about uni, it isn't like Black people on them. It's white. So it's like, why should I go if I know no one is going to be like me? Everyone is like, why? So you don't want to do a lot of stuff. Another one says we've got like two societies that represent us. There are two things we can relate to compared to God knows how many things white people can enjoy. So I think here it's about kind of ensuring that the offering, the extracurricular offering that we have is clearly aimed equally at everyone, that students feel able to be part and parcel of those activities. So because of all these different signs and signals of unbelonging, they had to respond in some way in order to kind of navigate the environment. So the first response that they talked about was how they conformed to perceived white norms as an effort to try to belong and to not stand out. So an example is given by this participant. I act presentable. I change my tone. Like I try to use bigger words when I'm talking. So it's like I just change everything. Because if I act the way I act around my normal people, automatically they stereotype me and look at me down. By automatically looking at me, they stereotype. But once I open my mouth, that's when they take a step back. Like, oh, I wasn't expecting that kind of thing. So clearly, students have to make changes about themselves related to their identity. And this is quite similar to what's been found in other studies. So, for example, participants in Greaves et al. Talked about how when they're preparing to speak or approach their lecturers, they put on their white voice to try to counteract some of those stereotypes that people might have of them. Participants also talked about other changes they make. In this case, this participant is talking about facial expressions. So facial expressions can be stereotyped. In this case, the angry Black person stereotype. So they make a conscious effort to try to change their facial expressions. So the participant says, and I would be forced to like relax my face a bit, and it's just long. They would be thinking I'm angry, but I'm not. It's just my facial expression. So this participant is talking about how they prepare to engage in workshops, and how it puts them off actually because of the effort they have to go through. And when they say it's just long is a colloquialism to show that something is effortful. So clearly, there's quite a lot that goes on there in terms of changing those aspects about themselves to try to try to counteract those stereotypes. So these kinds of strategies that participants talk about are similar to those that have been identified in other studies where they talk about ethnic identity concealment. And this ethnic identity concealment are really engaged in as a means of reducing the salience or the visibility of a stigmatized ethnic identity. In the literature, it's been identified that these kinds of strategies are both psychological and physically demanding, and they've got other maladaptive outcomes as well. So, for example, the impact on factors such as self-esteem. Another response, they talked about the mindsets that they have, and I think this participant sums it up quite nicely because they're talking about how their mindsets could either be a barrier to them engaging or could be a source of resilience. So the participant says, I kind of agree, and then like a small part of me kind of disagrees because I feel like it's also like our mindsets as well. Like we could see something and be like, oh, that's only for white people. Like I went on DMU Global as well, and I think I was the only black girl on the trip. I can't remember. I think there was a mixed race girl too. But it wasn't for me like looking at the advertisements, there's many white people like. I actually wanted to go like for me personally, for my own experiences. So participants were able to kind of see beyond those signals of unbelonging, reported these kinds of mindsets that allowed them to then engage in various activities. Others also spoke about the difficulties of being exposed to racism frequently and how it made them question everything and make and become skeptical about engaging. So these are the kinds of difficulties that they experienced. The final response was that of feeling an overwhelming sense of pressure to overcome these racial barriers. So participants were very much aware of these racial barriers that they had to overcome in order to succeed. So this participant says, yeah, I agree, because I feel like we know that it's kind of harder for us to get to where we want to be. So that the pressure is kind of overwhelming. So like we're trying our best to make sure that we succeed and we're doing that better than our peers, but sometimes the pressure isn't really good. So other participants in other studies talk about how they feel Black people have to be twice as good as them as their white counterparts in order to receive the same level of recognition. Sorry. Other participants talk about the pressure that they feel to positively represent the entire race. I mean, in the Grieves et al. Study, they were talking about how failing exams felt like they were letting the Black people down. The way it's that pressure to kind of overcome these stereotypes and these barriers. So you can see how this kind of pressure might negatively impact on student engagement and outcomes. So I've talked through a lot of challenges that Black students experience, and I think what was clear to me, what was clear to us as a research team, is that yes, we understand that being a student is challenging in itself. Students have to overcome a range of barriers in order to succeed at university. But these kinds of studies help us to understand the additional set of challenges that Black and other ethnic minority students might have over and above those challenges of being a regular student. So in this case, it's all centered around this lack of belonging that they have and the responses that they have to engage in as a response to that lack of belonging. So I've picked out an example here of ethnic identity concealment. So participants were talking about changing themselves, putting on their white voice, relaxing their faces, and all these things that they feel they have to do to counteract those negative racial stereotypes associated with Black people. And engaging in such behavior consistently, it's psychologically demanding, it's physically demanding, it has an impact on self-esteem. And students often talk about how anticipating having to engage in this behavior before either seeking support or engaging in activities, workshop activities, and so forth, puts them off. So some students in the focus group talked about how they'd go into a workshop, and if there's and then they would sit alone by themselves because of kind of the anticipation of having to engage in some of these activities. So researchers also identified that ethnic identity concealment reduces performance-related self-confidence, lowered self-esteem, and so forth. So these are clearly harmful behaviors for students to have to engage in. Thinking about the implications then for the findings, I think one of the main factors to come out is that importance of representation in the staff, in the student body, in the curriculum. It's quite important having when we think about our student journeys and who they encounter during their time at university, just being able to have people that look like them, that they can relate to feel a sense of belonging and community. And also for those aspirational purposes. I mean, we talk about in academia how there's this lack of representation, and part of that comes from that aspiration, being able to aspire to become part of the academy, and that pretty much is also driven by having people there that represent you. So representation is quite important. And I think this is why it's important to look at these things at a program level as well, because you get a sense of understanding in terms of how the students on the program, how the Black and ethnic minority students experience some of these factors. It's also important to create an environment of acceptance and celebration of diversity where students feel like they can be themselves. They do not have to change aspects of their ethnic identity to be accepted or to be seen for their actual abilities and what they can bring. So it's about creating an environment where everyone is accepted and celebrated for who they are. A recommendation to come out of this is conducting listening sessions at program level, really understanding what's happening with Black and ethnic minority students at the program level so that some of these can be meaningfully redressed. So creating safe spaces for communicating race-related issues with students, having clear pathways about kind of how to respond to race-related issues as well. Creating spaces for co-creation with students because they themselves will have some ideas in terms of what could be done to increase their sense of belonging on programs. So it's quite important to engage in these activities at program level. Cultural competencies for both staff and students. A lot of the experience that we're talking about, all these factors they were exposed to, it was from both staff and students as well. So we have to understand the way that race and race issues operate in society. And as higher education institutions, we cannot assume that we are immune to these factors. So having, a space for enhancing cultural competencies for staff and students is quite important as well. And when in doubt, you can also consult the Decolonizing DMU toolkit. There's quite a range of resources on there that are useful. For example, if you want to put on some co-creation workshop with students, there's a wealth of resources on there that can be used. Finally, I just want to quickly reflect on my position within this research. So this was a weird one for me because I identify as a Black Zimbabwean female. And so there was that sense of shared ethnic identity with my participants. The participants clearly picked up on that. They were quite comfortable. We we built rapport quite quickly within the focus groups, and they were able to freely discuss the race issues that they were exposed to. But some of it's also because at some stage I was also a Black psychology undergraduate student, so I quickly understood and knew what the participants were talking about, but also I had to kind of take the researcher approach and perspective and ensure that I'm asking participants to elaborate, even though I knew what they were talking about. But I was quite keen to ensure that it was their voices that were being represented during this piece of work, and not colored by my own experiences as well. So I was wary of that throughout the process, but and I also identified my own sense of privilege, being a highly educated individual, being part of the academy, and I'd somewhat become detached from the student experience because it was a long time ago for me as well. So these are all the kind of different issues that were there for me approaching this piece of work. And also reminding myself of some of these experiences that I've been through as a student. But having kind of two other researchers on the project allowed for that centering of the participant perspective as well. Okay, I think that's the end of my presentation. I'll stop sharing. Thank you very much. And if you've got any questions, we've got Jess here on the panel as well for questions.
So Blessing, a virtual round of applause from us all. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. And just to summarise a few of the comments in the chat box and leave some time, we've just got a few more minutes for chat, but also to respond to those great questions. I think there's a range of staff logged on today. I think we'd all take something away, hopefully, from some aspect of your talk and be able to reflect on it. One or two of the comments, particularly that you've identified, the emotional toll on yourselves as researchers hearing some of that negative feedback. I think all of us involved in the projects feel it's like you've said, it's so important to hear the student perspective, and it's illuminating, and especially there using direct quotes to contextualise some of the comments the students makes us all reflective. You're talking about the term BAME not being a homogenous group, so it's not, the experience of all. So a couple of people have identified, with that emotional toll. Some have said, that lack of representation perpetuates that feeling of academic inferiority. Engaging in students to close the awarding gap, though, one of our external respondents, I think, is identifying that when to close the awarding gap is viewed differently in different institutions, not as a deficit model, as you stated at the outset, but more as a way of supporting minoritized students, consider what needs to change across all levels. So I don't know if you wanted to reply to that, because I think that's a very valid point.
Thanks, Bernie. I think just to clarify, when I talked about the deficit model, it was really more from kind of a historical perspective, because that was the initial approach that was taken. If you look at a lot of the literature that was discussing the awarding gap, it was really kind of based on that deficit approach of looking at what was missing, or what was wrong in that sense in terms of Black and ethnic minority students. But yeah, there's been a move towards kind of a more student-centered perspective, and looking at more kind of looking at it more from a structural perspective as well. So that's why, I don't think I explained this. That's why we're using the term awarding gap as opposed to attainment gap, because calling it the attainment gap pretty much aligns with that deficit model, where the sole responsibility is placed upon students. And I've seen that term being used in recent times from some institutions. So there's still kind of, it's trickling away, and the literature has moved on somewhat, but there's still part of it. Part of that deficit approach is still quite evident.
Jess? Can't hear you, Jess. Sorry, you're still on mute. Sorry, Jess.
I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that quite a few people asked about Black History Month. Blessing, I'm so sorry, I didn't notice that there weren't any comments on that. I've actually brought up the anonymised transcripts from the Black History Month. Like, I could share them with the group if you felt like you felt able to comment like impromptu on that aspect. What do you think? Would that be okay? We could show the group those comments, those transcripts?
We could do. I mean, they were frustrated, I suppose, from the Black History Month perspective. Some didn't feel like it was given the due. It wasn't given as much attention as it should. Some felt that sometimes it tends to be more negative, the way that Black History Month is celebrated, focusing more on like slavery and all the negative aspects of Black history. So there was quite a mixture. It almost was like a sense of ambivalence towards Black History Month. Those are the kinds of frustrations that students had.
So should I suggest that that people on the call direct those comments, queries to you direct if they still want to do that? Jess had gone to the bottom of the chat. There is quite a lot of talk on the chat room, Blessing, for you to catch up with. I'm curious what frustrations the students expressed about Black History Month, but I think one of the comments here before that, could there be a historical psychological explanation on how Black students and/or staff interpret the responses that we get from our white counterparts? That is how we interpret some statements or behaviours is somehow influenced by the past. Could it be that white counterparts say or act in a way that may be normal in their own interpretation and do not really know how it makes us feel, us being, I just think, BAME, as you suggested, not the great homogenous group term, but the Black students that you interviewed.
Sorry, I think I'd need more clarity on that question. I don't think I understand what perspective is coming from.
So that person's still on the call if they wanted to add to the comment box. So they were quite a lot of the feelings that lots to take away. Yes, that's what I agree. I think every one of us, wherever we are in the university, in this institution or outside, that people have logged on, take something away from this afternoon. And people talking about that feeling, you've mentioned that term of othered quite a lot in your talk, Blessing, in relation to Black History Month. If the school institution does not consider the impact on their Black students when they are not included in the conversation and programme planning, that's very important, isn't it? And then again, the awarding gap seems to also shift the blame to academics, but this is a very complex issue and should be addressed at all levels within the institution. What your thoughts are, Blessing, Jess? Somebody's put their hand up, so, oh yes, the person who asked the questions put their hands up. Did they want to come on call? We're still being recorded.
Okay, hi, Blessing. Sorry, it's easier for me to explain myself this way. I was asking from the point of that you find that most of the answers you were giving, it's saying students feel that when the others move away in a lift, or the slowing down in the communication, like the first example that you gave. So my question was, don't you think that sometimes the way us Black people, I'm Black anyway, interpret some of these things, it's based on our experiences from the past, or there is a history from what happened in the past that make us interpret certain behaviors in our own way, but our white counterparts don't really act that way with any bad intentions. That was how I wanted to put the question across.
Okay, thank you, Felicitas, for that very interesting question. I think it's interesting you asked that because part of when you look at the extract that I gave about mindsets, and Black students, they did express this tension that they have between kind of their experience and whether they have got a propensity to look at everything through that lens of racism because they're regularly exposed to racism. So I think it's two things there. I think, first of all, it's kind of understanding the fact that because it's such a regular occurrence, so yes, it will have those historical that historical baseline, but then it's such a regular current occurrence. So you have to first of all acknowledge the fact that racism is present in today's society. And I think the second thing as well is one of the things that I did as well was kind of looking at what the previous literature said. So when you look at that example that you gave about the extract where the student talks about how people move away in lifts when they're in the lift, and that's associated with that stereotype of criminality. When you look at the report that was produced by Unite in 2022, so it's quite fresh, and they're talking about students' experience living in student accommodation, and there are those stereotypes of criminality present. Other researchers talk about how students have been approached, being asked to sell drugs if they're selling drugs, when there's no kind of, they are not selling drugs. So it's about the sum of what the evidence shows, right? So if you take if you take an anecdotal evidence, you can kind of interpret it in any way. But when the sum of evidence is showing a certain trend, then at some point you have to accept that it's part and parcel of people's experiences, and people are approaching people with those negative intentions.
Now, as chair, I'm going to reluctantly say we have to draw it to a conclusion. If you'll see that Krishna Patel from our events department has put a link to go straight to the 1 o'clock lecture that we've also got on our very busy programme of decolonising DNU tips, tricks and takeaways. I've put the link in the chat room for any other events that you might want to log on to this week. We've got a series of events over every day this week. Thank you again, though, Blessing. Thank you, Jess, for coming on the call and all the good work you've done. And I bet some of it might be on the toolkit. Blessing, if it isn't yet, you might put a link towards it.
No, we don't have it on the toolkit as yet. Yeah.
Okay, but you're happy for people to contact you direct. Okay,
yes,
thank you very much.
Needs more information in regards to the presentation, happy to be contacted and to have a chat. Thank you.
Overwhelmingly, loads and loads of thank yous, and again a virtual round of applause. Thank you both. I'm going to stop recording. Perhaps see you on the next call.